about the importance of Black blood donors. So I want to welcome everyone to this conversation, and I thank you very much in advance. So the purpose of this conversation is to talk about the relationship between the blood collection industry, the healthcare industry, and the African American community. We're going to talk about the history and the sources of mistrust felt by the African American community, but we're also going to talk about how we can be encouraging and talk about the need for diversity in the blood donor pool, as well as encourage individuals from all age ranges and all ethnic groups to donate blood. So I'm Dr. Yvette Miller, and I'm one of the executive medical officers for the American Red Cross. And I've been with that organization almost 25 years. So my primary focus is on the determining of eligibility of blood donors. But one of my other areas of focus is meeting the transfusion needs of patients with sickle cell disease. And so I invite my other panelist, Dr. Carla Williams, to just share some information with you about herself.
Hi, good evening, Dr. Miller. Great to be part of this discussion tonight. Always a pleasure to join you in talking about this important issue. I am on the faculty at Howard University here in the nation's capital, and my focus is largely around cancer, but our cancer program links with our sickle cell program as well under our Division of Hematology Oncology. And my work really centers around patient and community engagement, with a real focus on assuring that all communities have the type of information they need to make good healthcare choices, and importantly, then have the access to the healthcare that they need. So hopefully I can contribute something to today's discussion about how we can increase utilization and access as blood donors, and how we can all be involved in that.
Great. So thank you, Dr. Williams. And, Dr. Williams and I have worked together before, so it is absolutely joy for us to be doing this and working together again. Work that Dr. Drew did at the American Red Cross. And we'll talk a little bit more about his history and some of the sort of the controversial things that have been described and attributed to him as we go through this conversation. But I'd also like to give Dr. Williams an opportunity to talk about Dr. Drew's history at Howard University.
Well, absolutely. It's just amazing to think about walking some of the halls where, giants like Dr. Drew once walked. So, we all want to make sure that we are continuing that legacy of research and innovation. And I spend a lot of time talking to potential medical school candidates, people who want to come here and continue this legacy. And as we walk through the halls, we'll pass a picture of Dr. Drew, and I'll point out him and some of our other luminaries. And I'll always ask our applicants, when someone's walking through these halls 20 or 30 years from now, what will they say about you? So the legacy that he left to us is the legacy that we're trying to continue, and that we're just honored to be able to try to pass it on to future generations. So I'm just honored to be in the same space where he taught and did some of his work.
Thank you. That is so powerful to visualize what you just said to us, as walking down the halls and seeing portraits of Dr. Drew, and then in this moment challenging yourself to say, what is my legacy going to be? So thank you so much for sharing that information. So now I'm going to turn my attention to talking about sickle cell disease. And this is, of course, in relationship to why do we need a diverse blood supply, and why do we need Black blood donors? So sickle cell disease is the most common inherited blood disease in this country, and it affects approximately 100,000 individuals, the great majority, 90% or more of whom are African American or of African descent. And so African Americans make up about 13% of the US population, but we make up only about 4% of the blood donor population nationally. And so this is critical because African Americans have a unique set of antigens on their red blood cells because, over the past 400 years, the African population in this country has, intermixed and intermarried and intermingled with other individuals who have inhabited this country. And so our genetic pool is very diverse. And so what that means for patients with sickle cell disease is that those individuals who have sickle cell disease require multiple transfusions. Over their lifetime, they can require thousands of units of blood. So because of this, they have to have their blood be very closely matched between them and the donor. So there's a greater likelihood of finding a close match for a recipient from the population of African descent or Black or African American descent. So that is exactly why we need to increase donations from African Americans. So that, one additional thing is that, and we're going to continue to talk about this, is that COVID-19 certainly did uncover for the world to see the inequities in terms of, healthcare, access to healthcare, the significant amount of chronic conditions in the African American community. So we understand what some of the challenges are, but that still does not negate the importance of the African American community supporting the transfusion needs of patients with sickle cell disease. So I'd like to just share some information about the universal blood type. Most people are familiar with the blood type as being ABO and RH. RH is the positive or negative of a cell. For the general population, most of the individuals in the population in the United States are O positive. So we constantly need O positive blood, but we also need the full complement of people with all blood types, ABO and different RH types, to be available to transfuse blood to anyone. And so, I always already gave sort of explanation why we need to have some matching between the recipient and the donor based on race. But I recently had someone ask a question about if blood is basically the same and blood can be transfused to anyone, why do we donate blood for patients with sickle cell disease? So in this country, the majority of individuals that are blood donors are Caucasian. So about 80, maybe even 83, 84% of those who donate blood are Caucasian. And while we certainly can find compatible units for patients with sickle cell disease, in the Caucasian population, it is much easier to find a compatible unit in the population of African American donors. So now I'm going to just ask Dr. Williams to talk a little bit, to talk about health disparities and sort of what her thinking is about the basis of the mistrust for the healthcare community, healthcare establishment, in which the blood collection community falls within the healthcare establishment. Just talk some about the mistrust there.
Sure. I think that a place to start is understanding, we do have to understand the history. And when I say the history here, I'm talking about the history of access to care and how that access is really driven by a lot of structural factors that are more deeply related to the racism and discrimination in this country. And so when we're looking at today, it's sort of a snapshot, but it's like you have to look back in time to really understand the whole picture. So if you think about just, you can take any social issue and how it's going to eventually track up to healthcare access and trust. So if you think about education, and school systems were segregated, which meant that, opportunities to move into medical careers were more limited. Career options were more limited. And so the numbers of particularly Black physicians, African-American physicians, African-American women physicians was much more limited. The options weren't there. And so those are historical factors. My mother taught in a segregated school. So it's not that long ago. But all of that still tracks up to today, where now the diversity in the healthcare field isn't what we would like it to be. So people don't grow up having people who are not just look like them, but from their neighborhoods, people that are their neighbors, their friends and family that they know, people that they interact with. And so not having those sorts of models, role models, people that are part of our network socially that we know, creates more and more distance between individuals and their healthcare providers. So that's just one example of how historical factors are now having a systemic impact on what we're seeing today. And you could pick any other factor. You could pick, the justice system. You could pick employment, and how so many ways that have led up to what we're seeing today, where when you, depending on where you are, you may walk into a facility and no one there looks like you. No one, seems to kind of understand the unique experiences that you may be bringing with you. And so that creates distance, which can create feelings of uncertainty, which can potentially create mistrust. And it's also about how you're treated when you walk in the door. If you do feel that for some reason, be it ethnicity, race, language, income, that you weren't treated respectfully, then that's going to create another gap that's going to create more distrust. If you feel like you have to fight harder to get what is due to you in terms of your health care. So many people are insured by public programs, and oftentimes they feel that they may not be getting the best care. There's always a question there in their mind, in people's minds. Am I getting the best care that the same person is getting sitting right next to me, but who has, different characteristics? So all of those create gaps between communities and the healthcare system. The more gaps we have, the bigger those gaps are, the more distrust has opportunities to develop. And so when we talk about trust, we really have to talk about the fact that these systemic factors have existed, they continue to exist, and unless we're intentional about addressing them, they're going to continue to exist. So while trust is about what happens when you walk into a medical care facility and you see a healthcare provider in that moment, just realizing that so many decades led up to that moment and what you're going to experience in that moment, and whether or not that provider has even their own internal biases that they may not be fully aware of. And so all these things give people pause, and it makes us question in our mind, are we being treated the same? Are we getting the best care? Are we getting optimal care? And so when you have that hesitation, when you have that question, when you have that concern, then that could cause people to not access healthcare when they need it. And then if that starts happening, and then you have to look at people's environment, your food environment, your living environment, your access to walkable neighborhoods, all of that is also equally systemic. And so these things start piling up. And so then you asked me about the term disparities. The disparities are a result of everything else that I just discussed. So they don't just crop up all of a sudden. It's because of all these historical systemic issues that pile one on top of the other. And then we'll throw up a chart, and we'll compare African Americans to other populations, and we see, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, higher rates of cancer mortality, higher rates of diabetes. But a lot of that is due to all these social factors, social and political factors that lead up to where we are today. So that's my take on disparities. It's not something that happens in the moment. It's something that is historical that we have to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Great. Wow, that is so rich. So thank you, Dr. Williams. So now I want to sort of circle back around to Dr. Charles Drew. So one of the questions that I commonly get from people specifically from the African American community is that they understood that the American Red Cross segregated blood. While that is a true statement, that me talk about the whole story. So this was back in the 40s when the Red Cross was asked to, I guess late 30s, early 40s, to provide blood to the armed forces. And so it was the Red Cross policy for anyone to donate blood, regardless of race. But it was the policy of the US military to segregate blood. So to honor the the promise and the responsibility to provide blood to the US military, then that is why that policy was adhered to. And there's another, um, I guess this is definitely a myth. That was just a reality check with what I just talked about, but this is definitely a myth that Dr. Charles Drew left the American Red Cross because he was against the policy of segregating blood. While he certainly was against the policy of segregating blood, he had actually left the American Red Cross prior to that policy being instituted. And so research has been done that has shown that when he left to the Red Cross, he actually went back to Howard University. He was the chief of surgery there and went back to assume some different responsibilities at the university. And so there has been no evidence uncovered that he left the Red Cross because of that policy. So I always like to clear that up because, you know, I still hear questions around that all of the time. So, so now I want to turn our attention to, you know, Dr. Williams has already talked about that mistrust. And so my question to Dr. Williams is, what kinds of things? So my thinking is that in order for communities of color, African American community and communities of color to trust the healthcare establishment and blood collection organizations, you basically have to prove that you're trustworthy. So, because that's really gets at the, you know, the crux of the matter. So, in your opinion, what kinds of things can the not just a healthcare establishment, but the general, you know, governmental and establishment and our political system, as well as our criminal justice systems, in your thinking, what kinds of things can those communities do to show that they are trustworthy and that people can believe what it is they're telling us? So just a little bit, just to go a little bit further, you know, we're being encouraged to take the COVID vaccine. And so, you know, the more and more data is coming out, absolutely, that is showing the positive aspects that's coming out of this encouragement. There is still some hesitancy and mistrust there. So in your opinion, what kinds of things would really encourage people to trust the word of those saying, it's a vaccine, it's for your good, take it?
I think I touch on two things. On the trust issue, for me, trust is about relationship. It's about presence. I've had a chance to get to know you or you through your organization, and I've been able to see what you're about, see what you're invested in, see if your values align with mine. So to allow people to see that, organizations have connection where people can learn about the organizations, learn about their missions, their structures, the diversity within the organization. Is the organization really committed to the types of values and goals that align with my own? And so that's really where trustworthiness comes from, because it's really about, if you're talking about a healthcare organization, it's really about, you know, what are your values? And people can discern those values from how organizations operate. Does an organization have a consistent commitment to important causes in their local community? You know, not just the holiday things, but are they there? Are they there on a regular basis? You know, I talk about the fact that this concept of health equity and disparities are not new, but newer, terms, hot topics, so to speak. But the work that we've done is founded on that. That's our founding mission. That's where we started before there was a word for it. And so what we want to know is, even if you're coming at this type of work to address equity and issues of health justice, even, what's the depth of that commitment? And there's different ways that can be made evident, but I think it's what people want to see and what organizations do every day. How do they treat people in terms of access to care and access to their resources? Do they make sure that, for example, language access is easily accessible? Are they attuned to different types of diversity, gender diversity, et cetera? Is it evident that those kind of things matter? So I think that's where the trust and trustworthiness begins. We get to see what the organization values and what their values are, and are they living out those principles? When it comes to then having to make important health decisions, I think an important piece is assuring that people have not only the information they need, but some tools by which to make decisions. So it's one thing to put up some statistics and say, this is, like with the current vaccine, 95% effective. But are we committed to helping assure that people have had their own questions answered? And that goes back to the organizational trust. If you're really about a mission of equity and justice, then you're going to allocate resources to make sure that happens. And people will see that happening in their communities. They'll be invited to be part of that. And so, and I think this is true in many places, that, in your local area or region, the organizations that are there for the community. They may not always advertise their work, but you see them, you see what they do, and people share stories, and the stories are not always a great way, because sometimes, one story amplifies against other things that a negative story might amplify against a lot of other good stories that didn't get talked about. So that's not always the best way, but people have a sense within their own communities of, where their different groups are in terms of being committed to key causes. So to me, that's where the trustworthiness has to begin. It has to begin with your true commitment as an organization to important missions, such as what you've been talking about with the Red Cross and with blood donation and equity, and assuring that the need is met and people can see that. So that's my take on it. And then from there, then it's, once you see the organization, then you can see about the individuals, and we can take individuals as they are, but you want to know from an organizational standpoint, what is that commitment?
And again, that was so rich. And so we've had this conversation before about, in this space, we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so the whole inclusion piece is, we would have to be talking about inclusion if people from communities of color are already at the table when decisions were being made. So, I love this conversation that we had about that, sort of in another arena, but can you, again, just share your thoughts about, being at the table from the beginning, rather than having to be invited to the table to be included, sort of on the back end?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Dr. Miller. And again, kind of two sides to that coin as well. One is, as I said, within your organization, what is the diversity within your organization itself? And if you're really committed to these issues, then your organization is going to demonstrate that through its leadership and through hiring practices and through practices of developing staff and opening opportunities for pathways for people. So it would come through in that way. But the other piece is when we're actually trying to then reach out. We use the term engagement, but I think we can say reach outside of our walls, reach outside of sort of our day-to-day 9-to-5 things that we do, and engage other individuals and groups in those activities. That's where that piece about respecting and valuing the strengths that the communities bring. And it's not a top-down, paternalistic, I'm going to come and tell you what you need to know. It's the ability to say, we're here to learn. We're trying to be a learning organization. We're here to listen. We're here to understand what your priorities and values are. And that gets evidenced, for example, in ways that organizations are advised by and informed by their communities, and the extent to which those community views and values get integrated into their work. That is the real key. If you're hearing from communities, here's what we need. We need, expanded hours, or, we need more bilingual staff. If you're really attuned to that, then an organization will be responsive to that. And then that goes back to trustworthiness, because not only did you go out and listen, but you took the information back and you began to make changes. I think people quote Maya Angelou that says, when you know better, you do better. And so there's some things that organizations have to learn about the community's needs. But if we see that information is being integrated and the organization is growing and changing to meet and match the needs of the people they serve, then to me, that's a way to build trust. And that's a way to show that we're valuing the voices of the community. And you want to have those voices integrated, not only in your own staff leadership and those diverse experiences in your staff leadership, but have ways that you can get those outside voices and make those voices matter. And you can tell when organizations are learning and growing in that way. Oh, you're muted. You must have gone off.
Okay, yeah, great, thank you. So, so now let's talk a bit about our personal experiences. So, I'll start by talking about how I see, systemic and structural racism and how it has affected me in my life and, my view of the community. So, I really look at how the African-American community has been treated in terms of looking at historical trauma. And so trauma is passed on, or the feelings and thoughts and emotions about trauma, are passed on from generation to generation. And so and it's additive. So the generational trauma from, my grandparents and my parents were told that, and then, the trauma that my parents told me about, and then, what I have encountered in my life. And so, each one of those traumas is additive, and it has an effect on, the trust that you have in what you know that you need to do. So I know I need to, go to the doctor and take care of my health and do and exercise and all of those kinds of things. But, even being a physician, I still have a lack of trust when I go to the doctor that I'm going to get the treatment that I see other people getting or my colleagues getting. So, it's a constant presence. And and being the healthcare provider that basically provides, medical advice to lots of my friends and certainly my family and colleagues, they look to me to be the voice of the family and give advice and counsel. And so I constantly, personally do struggle with, trying to understand what's going on in this environment. We're all the talk now all the time is about vaccines. But I know the overarching goal is the protection of my family, my loved ones, and my community, in terms of giving that advice. And so that has been my experience. And so one of the places that I hold for my family as well as for my community is bringing my authentic voice and thoughts to a conversation. I know sometimes we try to, pick the right words to say, or approach a situation with the right words so we are not turning people off. But conversations about racism and inequity and lack of access, that calls for authenticity and realness. And so when you're trying to spend all that energy and all your resources on trying to find the right word, that dilutes the story. And so I tell my story because that's how we relate to each other, is by telling these stories and sharing these rich experiences that we have. And my approach is, I try to step outside of my lived experience to understand someone else. And so I invite others to step outside their lived experience and hear my story and try to understand where I'm coming from. And so that's my approach to this situation of how we deal with structural racism and dealing with inequities, and how to encourage and be supportive of where we are in this community and how we can move forward with meeting our needs, for our individual selves, as well as for our community members and for our family members. So, Dr. Williams, I encourage you to sort of share your thinking about, racism, and what your approach is and how you step into this space.
Wow. So I think I will speak in a few different ways that it's been kind of, I've encountered it. So I've encountered it directly, just directly, bluntly, with, name calling, and inappropriate interactions, and I'm, as in outside of this area where I'm living now, growing up, I won't say it was common, but it happens. And so I've lived that directly and personally. And the benefit of having a community where I knew that that's where I drew my strength from was what allowed me to sort of put that in its place and recognize all the opportunities that were set before me. And that I started off talking about history, and I'll turn back to history, because it's not only the history that led to all the structural inequities that we see and the systemic inequities, but also the history that has allowed us to become who we are, and to leverage every single millimeter or ounce of opportunity that's out there, to overcome all the barriers that I've personally experienced on top of those of all of my ancestors. So kind of turning the lens on that, I find to be so empowering and powerful, but yet those experiences still happen. Even in healthcare, I've, been, for my parents, was one to help with their healthcare, and had to make sure that I was advocating and making sure that, decisions weren't being made based on, things that were not about their health and their biology, to make sure. And sometimes it helped, because you didn't know how you were going to be treated based on the perceptions of that provider. And so it's tiring. I will say it's tiring, because you always have to sort of make sure that you're fighting for the best for yourself and your loved ones. And it shouldn't have to be a fight. And you're not ever sure if it's going to be, but you're always braced for it, in case it is. And not only is it tiring, I think it's a source of stress. So I think that's something that we need to understand about our own health, is that, living in an environment where this can happen at any moment. It can come out of left field. I've been in stores where many people have had the experience of being followed. I'm just here to purchase an item, but out of left field, I'm not experiencing it. And now I've got to have this reaction. I've got to process it. And so, it's that sort of thing that is an added stressor that other ethnic groups may not experience and may not understand. And the more you add that on, in more and more ways, I think that is going to have a direct impact on people's health and well-being. So I think there's no real obvious solution to that. But I think recognizing it and assuring that we individually have our own way of processing and dealing with that. And as I said, making sure that we are part and connected to communities where we can sort of release those microaggressions, as we would call them today. I think that's critically important. And there's just some things about the Black experience that are just so unique. And I thought about this the other day, that, our history in this country, as you talked about, the intermarriages and the admixture of just, how we have experienced our lives in this country. And one day I thought about the fact that, I actually don't know my name. Like, I literally don't know what my name probably should be. And so living with all of that is pretty heavy. It's something you can't think about on a daily basis, but you have to have a place to process that sometimes. You have to have a place to be honest about it, to acknowledge it, and to have that support structure that allows you to acknowledge it and honors that experience that we have. So to me, those are some of the aspects of racism that we don't talk about as much, because we just have to deal with it every day. So I think it's important that people understand that it is okay to have those moments where we're just frustrated and we're just tired of having to deal with it, having to be on guard all the time. And it's just part of life. Life is never going to be perfect, and everyone, no matter what their race, ethnicity, background, is going to have something like that they carry. But I think that's something that's unique to being Black in this country.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about racism and the stress response. So a couple of years ago, I actually did some research on racism and how it affects the body. And so when a person experiences racism, and it can be individual, it can be sort of these what are called macro aggressions or microaggressions. I don't categorize them in terms of size, because aggression is aggression and the result is exactly the same. So being followed in the store makes you just as upset as if you deserve a promotion and somebody who was not deserving got the promotion. So something, whether it's a large incident or a small incident, the result is exactly the same. It's that it stimulates the body and puts us into that fight or flight response. And so when a body is constantly bathed in those fight or flight, adrenaline, cortisol response cycle, that is what leads to the wear and tear on the body. That leads to hypertension. That leads to heart disease. That leads to not making some of the best choices for yourself. And so all of those things ultimately can lead to basically being in a PTSD situation. And so that there are things that happen every day, you just going along, in your everyday activities, and something happens that triggers you. And that's basically what the PTSD response is. You're going to the store, you're having, sort of the best part of your day, and something like that happens. Somebody follows you, somebody makes, an irritating, nasty remark. That triggers you and just puts your body into that fight or flight response. And so, I mean, you hear people say, and we've all heard people say, this statement about slavery. Slavery happened 400 years ago. I don't know anything about slavery. Why don't people in the Black community just get over it? We can't get over it because it's literally, that trauma is literally part of our DNA. And so we have to support and teach each other, how to care for ourselves and be able to be more resilient and sort of break that cycle of that being in that cortisol response, so that we're able to relieve ourselves of being in that fight or flight mode, so that our bodies and our minds and our psyches, don't take that hit from that chronic state of just feeling like you're being preyed upon. So that, again, it's something that I find myself in that space, constantly, of helping people to understand how to get to be your resilient self, get out of that space, calm yourself down, practice self-care. And that's exactly what it is. It's a practice. It's something that you have to pay attention to your body. We in this country are so cerebral. We're always in our head thinking about something. When you get these, racist remarks made to you, or someone's, this racist or, action against you, it puts you into this, your body into this fight or flight response. But you have to understand what that feeling is. When your heart starts to race, or you can feel, your blood pressure going up, or you can feel your face getting red, that is the point where you have to understand what's going physiologically and find ways to shut that down and bring yourself back to a resilient, calm space. So that's where I spend a lot of my time, working with individuals with how to be their resilient selves. Do you have any comments or any stories related to how we do what's best for ourselves in terms of dealing with chronic conditions? And we know what we're doing to ourselves in terms of smoking and overeating and weight control and those kinds of things. What are your thoughts and your experiences around that?
I think you covered a lot, self-care, but all of that falls under the umbrella of self-care. So sometimes we think of that term as, taking that personal space to decompress as self-care. Keeping our boundaries as self-care. Those are all critically important. But our health is part of our self-care. So talking to college students. Of course, there's opportunities to stay physically active, but you have to balance that with school. And as you get older, the balance gets harder and harder to keep. Choosing healthy lifestyles, I think, is part of self-care. Social interactions, positive social interactions are part of self-care in the real and the virtual world. We know that social isolation is starting to emerge as another public health crisis. But then we have other crises like violence in our communities that are other sources of stress beyond the racism that might come from out groups. We have challenges within our own communities, and those are myriad on top of themselves. So and I think another point of self-care could be contributing. Because when we feel like we're contributing to the solution, maybe it gives us a different vantage point on the problem. And so I think maybe an understated aspect of self-care is within our own limits. How are we extending ourselves to others? How are we seeing ourselves as being part of a solution? And that goes back to our critical talk today. We're talking about in terms of helping communities to make sure that their blood supplies are strong. And that could be a very simple way to feel like we are making a contribution. And the feeling that we get when we know that we are giving some of the best of ourselves, that actually, I think, is something that is a way to really protect our own mental health. So it's not just about the things that we sort of close off and protect ourselves within, but it's also about how we open ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, we spoke about having a seat at the table and being able to determine what is best for your community. And again, I appreciate you circling back to that. One of the really simple ways that we can do, now that we understand the connection between African American blood donors and meeting the transfusion needs of patients with sickle cell disease, just simply when make space in your life to donate blood. Only humans can donate blood to other humans. You might hear things about there being artificial blood and those kinds of things. At this point in time, in our existence, that does not exist. Only human beings can donate blood. And so it's a simple act. And just last week, I had a conversation with a mother whose child had sickle cell disease. And I frequently hear people say, I don't want to donate blood because I'm scared of needles. And, I just remember her rich conversation where she said, my child has sickle cell disease. And for her entire life, she has constantly been stuck by needles. And because of the complications of the disease that she has, all I'm asking you to do is roll up your sleeves and get a single needle put in your arm. It's just a pinch right at the beginning of donating blood. So just think about what happens to you versus what happens to my child when she's constantly stuck and goes to the hospital and needs treatment. Please just step outside yourself for a moment and please roll up your sleeves and donate blood for people that need that have sickle cell disease and need treatment. And I couldn't have said it any better than that, because that was just perfection. So we're gonna, again, thank you so much, Dr. Williams. We're gonna sort of wrap up this conversation. And so I give you the opportunity to share sort of your last thoughts in few words that before we just can wrap up.
Well, I think I would end on the note that you touched on with that story about the mother and her child. And I think for many of us, people like me, even though I work in a healthcare field daily, blood donation isn't always top of mind. So it's great when I have an opportunity, say through my employer, or my school is an employer in this case for me. So your college or your faith community, your sorority group, when those opportunities are presented, then, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great thing to do. And I'm definitely signing myself up. So that's why having our HBCU organizations be involved, I think is so critical, because that's how we get this information in front of people, because it's not something that we walk around unless we're affected by it. We don't walk around every day thinking about, oh yeah, it's about time for me to donate blood. But I will say that I shared this with students in my class, because I teach classes around health behavior. And I said, for all the theories that we have about, ways to help people change behavior that they want to change, the one thing that really matters is identity. So if I identify myself as someone who enjoys exercise and is committed to exercise, I'm going to do it because it's part of my identity. So I think if we can start to build that identity as blood donors, that it's part of who we are, and we make sure that at least once a year we donate, but I think, Dr. Miller, we can donate more often than that, correct?
That's right. We absolutely can. Thank you, Dr. Williams. So yes, as a matter of fact, we can donate every 56 days. A person is eligible to donate blood. And, sort of my words of encouragement is that we certainly do have multiple competing priorities in the African American community, one of which is blood donation. But, understanding that the African American community is directly connected to patients with sickle cell disease, I do encourage you to roll up your sleeve and donate blood. We're also in the process of, post-COVID, and we're collecting convalescent plasma to help treat patients that are recovering from COVID-19. So I do encourage everyone that's eligible to donate blood to please also, if you've recovered from COVID-19, donate convalescent plasma. And, as mentioned earlier, we're absolutely looking to diversify the donor pool, both in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of age. The average blood donor is a Caucasian man that's over 60 years old. So we definitely need to, continue to engage and educate and encourage a wide range of individuals to donate blood, particularly our college age students. And, we're also engaging our high school students because they're quickly, going to college. So we like for people to get to understand and to know the importance of blood donation when they're high school students. So my last words is just sort of our commercial break here, but we'd like to thank the Survivor Corps and the University Blood Initiative for bringing this talk together. And again, Dr. Williams and I have partnered before, and we just love sharing space together. And thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for bringing your rich experience to this conversation. And we'd also like for you, if you're interested in donating convalescent plasma, you can go to survivorcorps.com. And again, if you're interested in knowing what's going on with the University Blood Initiative, that's their email address or web address is universitybloodinitiative.com. So again, I thank everyone today for your attention, and we hope that we have delivered to you some wonderful information and have been encouraging of you to roll up your sleeves and donate blood. And if you have recovered from COVID-19, to donate convalescent plasma, and definitely those folks, in the younger age range, to please roll up your sleeves and donate blood as well and become lifelong blood donors. So thank you everyone for your attention today.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. It's a pleasure joining you today.
Thank you.